Hello and welcome to the 25th episode of Manav Data Series, our webinar on data science. I am Ritika moderating this session. Almost a year ago, we aired our first episode in this series, which is a part of Manav Project's initiative to prime students about the process of data collection, data analysis, and interpretation in diverse fields of science. We do hope we could initiate the uninitiated and indulge the interested. In the past one year, we have traversed this landscape of data science with all the interesting speakers giving us a glimpse into a wide area of topics which are varying from application of data science in proteomics, systems biology, public health, precision medicine, neurosciences, astronomy, entrepreneurial avenues, and many more. Recordings of all these webinars are archived onto our Manav YouTube channel so that anyone can access them as per their convenience. We hope you all keep learning and benefiting from these talks. Your participation has been very encouraging. Thank you. And we hope to continue in our efforts. In the series today, we have with us Dr. Guttal from the Center of Ecological Sciences, IISc Bangalore. He brings today yet another flavor into the fold of data science, aspects from ecology and wildlife, where entities show sheer freedom to move, or shall we say, are presumed to be random, and also display large diversity and numbers, but yet again manifest interesting patterns. His talk is titled Big Data Makes Sense Only in the Light of Theory, Examples from Ecology, and he will be talking about collective movements of fish schools and high-resolution satellite-based data from ecosystems. Now, before we get started with this interesting journey, I would like to mention a few important points for the session. The presentation would be for 30 to 40 minutes. It will be followed by a question and answer session for about 10 to 15 minutes. And all questions will be taken only at the end, not in the middle of the talk. Therefore, do write in your questions at the Q&A tab that you see below. After the talk, we will take a few minutes for a few more announcements for future activities on our platform. So thank you, Dr. Guttal. The session is yours now.
Thank you very much, Ritika, for a very, very generous introduction. I'm very happy to be on this forum, to be giving the talk, and especially on this eve of first anniversary, and congratulations to the entire team for putting this together in this last 1 year. I'm sure it's been a very, very exciting journey for both the organizers and the students and all the audiences who have been on these sessions. Today, I hope that I will live up to the expectations of set by various previous speakers, as well as slightly provocative title that I have given. Okay, so let me begin by sharing my screen. Okay, so I have shared my screen now. So I'm going to talk about how big data in the context of science broadly, but more specifically in the context of the research that I work on, makes sense only when we have an underlying theory or model. Now, of course, for seasoned practitioners of science, this is self-evident. This has to be true. But I thought I'm mostly addressing students and early career researchers who, therefore I have kept the overall flow of the talk fairly basic, and therefore I hope it will be accessible. Okay, so the broad outline for my talk today is as follows. I will discuss an article that came out a decade ago or so, on how the big data era will basically mean end of theory in science, and how scientific methods may become obsolete. Okay, now I'll discuss that article and summarize the article and tell you what I think are obvious points that are not correct about the article, and then I will then present our own work on where we use really big data analysis driven by theory. And I will show you how, in the absence of those theories and models, that those data are absolutely useless. Okay, so there is this extremely famous statement attributed by George Box, a statistician, who said that all models of the real world phenomena are wrong, but some are useful. And this is a profound statement, a very accurate statement, a very useful statement in itself about how we understand data. We understand data via models, and no model is correct. However, some models are actually useful for us to make sense of our world. And now comes this paper that I was a graduate student. Probably, I think I was just finishing, my PhD when I came across this article, and this article, made a lot of news back then, and it basically said, the data deluge, the kind of data that we are going to have, and we are already having back then, will mean the end of theory in science. Okay, and how the scientific method actually is going to become obsolete. Okay, and I did not take it too seriously back then. But the big data itself has become a big thing now, and in fact, rightly so. It has lots of powerful methods in it. So that's not the contention. But let's say what the article says. Okay, so the article begins by saying that we are now going to have, and we already have in many cases, petabyte scale data or information, and therefore these understanding these data sets calls for an entirely different approach. And it says this provocative sentence that it forces us to view the data in a statistical and mathematical way first, and then only establish a context later. This is exactly opposite of what we do in science. Right? We always think of the context and questions, and then data and mathematics will then follow. And this sort of a counter to what we usually think. And then and continuing, this article quotes a research director from Google who says that all models are wrong, and increasingly you don't even need them, right? That's this is sort of an interesting twist to the first quote I began with. That, all models are wrong, but some are useful, and this person now is saying you don't even need those. And then the article argues that because of this massive data, the current or the classical approach to science, which is to hypothesize, model, test your hypothesis, and then keep on refining your hypothesis, models, and understanding of real world, that entire scientific enterprise is going to become obsolete. And it continues to say that we just need correlations. We don't need models at all. Okay. And of course, these are remarkably provocative statements. Okay, and to justify these statements, it gives some examples, two examples, one from physics, one from biology. And the biology example is that of sequencing. It talks about how Craig Venter, a renowned biologist, has sequenced organisms and all the way through ecosystems, and in the process has discovered thousands of previously unknown species. Okay, and then sort of it concludes saying that by sort of doing this kind of large data-driven analysis, what the author calls Google quality computing. Okay, Venter has advanced biology more than anyone else in this generation. As you can see, of course, this is not a scientific journal articles. There are remarkable number of hyperboles and exaggerated statements, which are sort of almost self-evident that that's highly exaggerated. Which is also precisely why at that time there was a lot of discussion about this. So I have summarized what that article was saying. So now, of course, in what follows, I'm not really going to say that big data or the methods of big data are really useless or bad. In fact, they're awesome and they're really great. In fact, we use them for research in our own lab, and they provide remarkably valuable information. And we know what are the different types of correlations possible in data. There are methods that really help us solve some really difficult problem by difficult problems by traditional methods of statistics. Okay. However, it's important to realize that having lots of data and having lots of correlations is in itself not science. Science is actually going beyond what is there in data, and science has to provide explanations for the observed patterns, phenomena in the data, and it has to synthesize what we have observed and say something more than what's there in data, and that's what we usually call models, theory, right? And these theory and models, they are not necessarily always mathematical. They could also be verbal descriptions, but nevertheless, this theorizing and synthesizing and modeling is actually at the end of the day science. There are some standard analogies are the facts or the data on their own are basically like bricks, but it's only by constructing them by means of theories and synthesis that we actually have a grandeur of what the real world phenomenon are. Okay, now let's go back to the sequences example that the article cites. Says that by the gathering of large number of sequences from air, water, ecosystems, they have discovered new species. Of course, if we had large sequence data from multiple species, we do find lots of correlations between species. We can find correlations between sequences and some functions if we know that what the functions of the or the traits of the organisms are, and so on. Of course, one can sort of build a huge repository of what different parts of sequences contribute in terms of organisms, behavior, and traits. However, if we begin to ask some fundamental questions, I think that's really where data and correlations alone become their limitations become very evident. For example, if we were to ask, can a large number of sequences of all types of organisms of the type that was mentioned in the article, can they in itself, using any methods of analytics, conclude that there was a common ancestor of all species? Okay, can existence of large number of genetic sequences, does it not automatically imply that there was a common ancestor of all species? Can it discover the principle of natural selection? Okay, these are the fundamental processes of biology, right? Can we discover these processes, fundamental principles, by the large data sets of sequences and correlations? Okay, and then we can ask this question. It's not just today that we are in the era of big data, and if we go back in history, probably in some sense, probably one of the really big data phenomenon was that of Tycho Brahe, having gathered data of planetary orbits over decadal timescales over his lifetime. He did not do much with those data on his own, but Kepler synthesized those large and high quality data of planetary orbits and positions to be very precise, not the orbits alone, or orbits themselves. He came up with laws of planetary motion. There are these three famous laws of Kepler's. Now one can ask the following question. By then, people were already working in the heliocentric paradigm of how the solar system existed, right? What would Kepler have arrived at the same set of conclusions if they were, let's say, rigidly focused on a geocentric, model of the world? For example, if Kepler had a computer of the type that we currently can access, and if we had crunched Tycho Brahe's data, would Kepler's laws of planetary motion, and even going forward, will Newton's laws of gravitation, will they all naturally come out of these big data sets that Tycho Brahe had? It was, of course, possible that one could have come up with a very precise statistical description of how planets move. That's probably possible, and it could have come up with very precise statistical models of how when we are observing planets and other celestial objects in the sky, It may even have a good predictive power. However, there is could these big data analytics have discovered Newton's laws, Kepler's laws, right? More fundamentally Newton's laws of gravitation. And of course, remember that Newton's laws of gravitation basically was putting apples and the celestial objects on the same pedestal. Any two objects, interact via gravitational forces with the, with that amazing simple mathematical equation of, of forces between two objects, right? Now, could a big data machinery have discovered this on its own? My claim, of course, when I say mine, I'm sure this is something that many people probably will say. I'm not saying I am the first one to be saying this. Big data analytics probably more, and in my opinion, cannot give you Darwin's synthesis of origin of species on its own, or the Newton's laws of gravitation, that sort of unified laws of motion across earthen objects and celestial objects. And that process of going from data to these theories and laws, fundamental universal laws, necessarily requires models and theories and hypothesis driven data analysis. And these theories and models, as I spoke, need not always be mathematical, like Newton's laws or the way Darwin's theory is, but they could be also verbal descriptions, right? And in fact, this requires creativity that big data statistics cannot substitute. Okay, and in fact, I think that more fundamental the science, or more basic the laws of universe you're trying to discover, it is likely that you need theory and models, and that's precisely where big data analytics will begin to not provide us much more useful things than saying, hey, look, these are all the correlations I have found, and I can make great predictions about this specific input. And moreover, even the very fact that there is big data, it's important to recognize that big data cannot exist in a vacuum of models. Okay, in fact, there are some implicit assumptions about the world, in the very fact that there is some big data with you. For example, why did anyone collect those big data? It could be, for example, satellite derived data of atmospheric wind motion, or it could be data of sequences. Remember, why do we even sequence? It's because at the end of the day, Darwin's evolutionary theory was the driving force that said, hey, look, there has to be something that transmits from an individual to the offspring. And that's where the idea of people were looking for that thing. They found DNA and they found sequences and so on, right? And so when we collect data, inherently there is a model that we are working with, model of the world we are working with. And why was the data collected in some specific ways? Again, there is some model of the world that we are having, which sort of either explicitly or implicitly important in collecting the data that the way we have collected. And that's really when the analytics are going to be eventually helpful, because we have collected those data in some contexts. And of course, one can even ask and go further, why did we even look for those correlations, right? So what I have done so far is hopefully have given some small flavor of maybe a sort of extreme opinion, and that was this article on big data, how this will cause end of theory. And I hope I have argued that theory is really important in making sense of data. Now let me jump to some of the work we have done in our own lab, where we have really huge and high quality data sets. However, they make sense only in the context of theory and models. Okay, so what is the data that I have with me? This is the data. What we have done here. We want to understand. We are looking at this school of fish. So these school of fish are in our lab. We have put them in a fish tank, and we have this high resolution camera that is recording their movement, that is recording what's happening in the fish tank. And in this specific case, there are about 700 to 750 fish. And as we can see, they are moving in sort of, really spectacular race. And let me tell you, they were not given any stimuli when they were moving. This entire motion is inherent to the fish schools that we are looking at. These are a species called carimine found in southern coastal part of southern India. Okay. And we can give you more data, because we have fish in our lab, we can do more of these videos. Okay. And for example, in this case, you are seeing about 60 fish which are moving in a tank, and we have this very high resolution recording of these fish schools. Okay. Of course, for anybody who is interested in animals, this looks really fascinating, right? But then we can ask the following question. So what do you do with these videos? They're nice, anybody can go and, for example, if we have gone to any place, right, where there are lots of animals, there are lots of birds flying, you may have taken a nice video or picture of flock of birds, right? Likewise, if you went to an aquarium, you can also make a very nice video. How do we do science with this? What do we do with these videos, right? It's important to recognize that these videos themselves do not make data. To even convert these videos to data, we need a framework to think and ask questions. We need a scientific framework. And then once we have asked these questions, we need theory or models that will tell us or give some hints of, for your questions, what data do you need? And how do you analyze those data? And for both of these, we actually need theory and models. Okay. So let me now present the framework of ecologists. Ecological worldview is that organisms are individuals and species. They're all a bunch of interacting set of organisms, and there are interactions between organisms of same species, across species, and from between plants and animals, and the entire ecosystem, and with the abiotic world. All these interactions eventually produce the living world that we see, and it's a fascinating world of basically interactions. And this is the framework we think about ecological systems. And going forward, because I come from a physics background, I actually think there are really, really rich parallels between physics and ecology. And this really helps us ask some kind of questions which are really interesting and novel. And again, this framework is useful to ask certain types of questions, which is otherwise not possible in a traditional ecological sense as well. It might be even surprising to many that what are the parallels between physics and ecology. So let me enumerate them. In ecology, we study individual organisms, their behavior, their physiology. It's somewhat similar to studying elementary particles and their properties in the context of physics. Okay, and then in ecology, we study what are the interactions between organisms and what are the interactions with the environment. This is analogous to studying interactions between elementary particles, such as electron-electron interactions, right? Proton-proton interactions, or or interactions between two, gravitational interaction between two massive objects. And finally, these interactions between organisms gives rise to collective behavior in ecosystems. This could be in the form of groups, populations, or ecosystems. Likewise, it is the collective behavior of interacting physical particles that gives rise to materials, planets, and even stars, and the entire solar systems to entire cosmological world. So whereas physicists study collective behavior of interacting physical particles, ecologists study collective behavior of interacting living particles. Okay, and in fact, this cartoon represents specifically in the context of animal groups how magnets, which is shown on the left-hand side of the slide, are actually analogous to flocks of birds. For example, magnets are basically collections of interacting electronic spins. And when all the electronic spins align themselves and point in the same direction, we have a magnetic material. Likewise, when all the birds or all the fish, when they interact to align their direction of motion, you have a flock of birds who are moving. So in some ways, one can think of flock of birds or school of fish as basically electronic spins which are actually moving. And this analogy is not superficial. In fact, when we try to understand animal collectives and even ecosystems, some of the methods that are developed in this physics context are actually very nicely applicable. And in fact, in ecological world, something more happens, something more interesting happens, which is because of evolutionary dynamics. Evolution makes something very interesting because organisms are constantly evolving their traits, which is sort of saying that electronic interactions are not always Coulomb's law, but maybe they are changing over time. Of course, we know that doesn't happen in physics, at least on the time scales that we are aware of. But in evolution, in ecology, that's a very much happening all the time. So therefore, we see more variations and more heterogeneity. And in some sense, studying ecology is basically statistical physics of heterogeneous and evolving interacting systems. So in some sense, this provides a framework, for those who are interested in how I think about links between physics and ecology. I encourage you to read this article that I wrote in Resonance, and also how ecology in some very interesting ways differs from other branches of biology. That's an article I wrote with my colleague Karthik Shankar, which came out only this year in January in Current Science. And if you're interested, please have a look at them. Okay. But this framework helps us ask questions. Once we see these, really fascinating patterns of schools of fish, we can ask, how do organisms exhibit these remarkable patterns? Just like physicists ask interactions between electrons and proton-protons, can we ask, what are the interactions between fish, right? That is producing this collective motion. We can also ask another very interesting question: why are organisms doing this? What are the costs of being in a group and moving in group? And what are the benefits of being in group and moving in groups? These questions are possible only because of the framework that I mentioned. If I go back to this question I mentioned, just because I have these very high resolution and beautiful videos doesn't mean I can ask questions. Because of this framework of collectives, framework of ecology and evolution, we can begin to ask questions about these systems. And once I have asked questions, in this specific case, I want to understand, how do fish interact to produce these schools? To really understand these questions, we need theory and mathematical models. Those videos alone are not going to tell me what are the interactions between fish and fish, right? So we now need theory and models. And what is the data we want to extract from these videos? And what kind of analysis we need to do. So as I mentioned, the framework is this inspiration from physics approaches. So we can think of animals moving as particles in motion, right? And now what do physicists do with particles in motion? They track the position of each particle over time, right? So for example, is it actually now meaningful and useful if we could somehow gather the X and Y coordinates of all the animals over a period of time? Okay, now if you just think about that, and if you think of that specific quantity, what in the video I showed, this video was taken, let's say, over 100 individuals, approximate numbers here. And we used a relatively reasonable resolution of recording, which is 25 frames per second. And we ran this, we recorded for 1 hour, 36,000, 3,600 seconds. How much data does it correspond to? It actually corresponds to 1 hour of basically video of 100 schooling fish corresponds to 10 million animal locations. And that's really, really huge. If you think about, if you compare it with classical studies on how animals look and how researchers look at animal behavior. Typically, researchers go with the binoculars in the, and then you will, really look at animals and you note down their behaviors. And of course, there's going to be really a lot of limitations on how much you really can note down manually when you're observing by your eyes. Here, with the help of the camera eyes and with the help of being able to extract data from those videos, we can have 10 million animal detections within 1 hour. And in fact, that corresponds to 100,000 instances of group behavior at sort of unprecedented accuracy. But here is the thing, we have lots of data now. What do you do with it? Right? I have locations of all these animals over time, but what do you do with it? Again, for example, as I mentioned, we want to get trajectories. This is where, ideas of computer science and image processing become very useful. When we just play this video again. Okay, it didn't play. Okay, so what we have basically done here is using simple methods of image processing and object tracking. What we are able to do is to obtain X and Y coordinates of each fish over a period of time. Now, once you have these locations over a period of time, this is like, sort of a gold mine of data, right? We have, it's like, imagine you really know if there are 100 particles, you really know at every location where was this particle. And maybe we can begin to now think, how are animals interacting from this? What if they were, moving entirely randomly? What could have been their behavior? But what if they were interacting? So we can begin to ask some questions about interactions. So coming back to the question, how do organisms interact? Can we infer something about this? How do organisms interact from the type of data you have? And it turns out that that's actually quite non-trivial. How can I really infer how each fish is interacting with another fish if all that I have is trajectories of large number of animals moving over time, right? And of course, there have been many works that that have tried to attempt these questions. Without going into details of this, in our work, we ask the following questions. What explains this animal fish group that are moving in a synchronous and directed fashion? And specifically, we want to understand how are animals maintaining this directionality as a group? What are the rules that animals are following that maintains this very nice directionality? So this group directionality is also called group polarization. So we want to understand this specific question using the kind of videos I showed. Again, going back to my question, what do we do with these videos? I told you that having a framework will help us ask questions, which I hope I have shown you by now. And then to really, those questions also gave us some hints. What kind of data is going to be useful for you, possibly useful for you, because we were using this framework of statistical physics. What it told you was that maybe having locations of all the animals over a function of time could be useful. So that we have now sort of gotten. The question then to ask is, now what do you do with this data? Okay, what do you do with this data? Again, we need theory and models. Okay, so let's see how we go about doing this. Okay, so this is, so now we are going to rely on some models and theories that people have built. So in 1990s, physicists came up with this really interesting but very simple computational models and also mathematical models of how animal groups move in this fashion. Is it that there are leaders in animal groups that make them move in this way? Do animals perform very complex interactions? Is that why they move this way? What this computational model showed was something very interesting. It showed that even when animals follow very, very simple rules, they can achieve high degree of group polarization. Okay, so we can quantify this group polarization by this quantity called Wycheck order parameter, which is basically a summation of the velocity vectors of all of the individuals. So if we take the velocity vector of each individual at every instant in time, and then if we do an average at every instant in time, you get this quantity m, which tells you how strongly or how weakly the group is directional in motion. For example, if this modulus of this quantity m is 0, that means that fish are roughly moving in random directions. They don't have directionality in their motion. On the other hand, if the modulus of this quantity m is close to 1, then the group is highly polarized. And as this cartoon shows, the fish are all moving in the same direction. Okay, so this inspires, this computational and mathematical models inspire us. Can we also calculate this quantity m in our data? Okay, and in fact, these computational models make a very interesting prediction that they say that this group polarization will increase with density. More the number of organisms in a given area, higher will be the degree of this polarization. That's what these models consistently predict. Okay, so let us see what do we find. If I have locations of all the individuals, I can calculate their velocities, right? I can calculate the directionality of each individual. I should be able to therefore easily calculate what is this quantity m, the group polarization. So that's what we have done here. I'm in the plot above, the topmost plot, where we have put 15 fish in a fish tank. We calculate this quantity modulus of m, which measures the directionality, the group directionality, as a function of time. We find that it's highly stochastic. However, it can reach all the way to 1, or also it can also come down all the way to 0, meaning from a highly ordered motion all the way to highly disordered motion. So a lot of they keep switching back and forth between these extremely different states of movement. And we find that this is true even for other group sizes, group size 30 and group size 60. Of course, now we have this quantity as a function of time. What do we do with this quantity? What else can we do? Of course, we can, because we have really high quality data, over several trials and over several hours, what we can do is we can construct the frequency histograms. Okay, now what does this frequency histogram show? Focus on the bottommost row here, the lowest third row. What you see here is that for small group sizes, this is the group size 15 on the left side, the most frequently occurring state is mod m close to 1, meaning the groups are very highly polarized. However, if you are looking at group size 60, they have actually become less polarized. This is becoming broader and broader. This histogram is becoming broader and broader. And we make an interesting observation here. These patterns basically show that the group polarization is actually decreasing with group size or the density, which is actually exactly opposite of the predictions made by the classic mathematical and computational models of collective motion. Okay, so this is very interesting, right? Now we have found something interesting, and this is interesting only because there was a mathematical and a computational theory that was saying exactly the opposite, right? Otherwise this observation alone, again, we don't know what to make out of it. Okay, now we have this group level property, but remember the initial question I set out to answer was, what are fish really doing? What is the individual level rules that fish are following that gives them these highly synchronized movement patterns? How can we understand this from the entire group level data? And again, for this, you need, what do we analyze and how do we analyze? We need theory and models. And we set out to do some theoretical work. And our work showed something very interesting. So we came up with, so what is the strategy for doing these models? So this is the strategy for doing models. How can we infer how fish interact by observing group or by analyzing group videos? The basic principle is as follows. We assume a variety of models where each model has its own set of interactions. For example, in model 1, we assume that fish interacts only with one neighbor. And then we make some predictions about a measurable quantity, such as group polarization. In model 2, we assume that fish interacts with two neighbors. And again, we make predictions about some measurable quantity. And of course, one can build this zoo of models. And then we can ask fish interacts, for example, one hypothetical model here is fish interacts with every neighbor, maybe an average of all the neighbors, and again make predictions. So for each of the models, we make some predictions about a measurable quantity. And then we find out which of these predictions is true in the real data. Okay, and that's precisely what we do. And I'll show you what we have done. We assume something called a pairwise interaction model. What does this mean? If there are two fish with some rate C, they align with each other. So that's called the pairwise copying interaction. In addition, fish also stochastically turns on their own when they are moving. Okay, they don't do any interaction, but they sort of spontaneously turn at some rate S in some arbitrary direction. We also considered a second model called ternary interaction model. In this ternary interaction model, we have both the pairwise copying interaction as well as stochastic interaction. In addition, we also have a ternary interaction model. This is more like classic models, the Vichek model I introduced, where if there are three fish, what happens is that the fish which is misaligned with the other two gets aligned with the majority. So in some sense, the ternary interaction model or the average interaction model basically tries to bring in consensus within local neighborhood. Okay, so I have shown you only two models right now, but what we have actually done is a whole series of model, pairwise, ternary, quartic, and so on and so forth. But I have just shown you two for the sake of simplicity here. And very interestingly, we can make some very beautiful predictions of how these models actually behave. Focus on the topmost row here. So what you are showing, what you are seeing here is the mathematical or the computational model results of how polarization changes with time if we had pairwise dominated system. On the other hand, on the right side panel here, you are seeing how will polarization change with time if we had ternary interaction model. Qualitatively, they look very similar. They sort of, appear very similar by eyes. And in fact, if you plot the histogram of these two time series data sets, you find them, they both have very similar features. They have two modes and they have a minima at 0. They have two modes which are close to +1 and -1, which means, at the level of histograms, they are indistinguishable. At the level of time series dynamics, visually, they are indistinguishable. However, what our mathematical models tells you something very interesting. It says that you can actually calculate, I'm sorry for the small font sizes here, you can actually calculate some kind of a force function. It's called drift function. And this drift function is dramatically different between these two scenarios. In the pairwise scenario, this drift function is actually a linear function of the polarization. On the other hand, in the ternary interaction model, this drift function is actually a cubic function. And that's really interesting, which means that if we can somehow construct these drift functions from real data, right? If it turns out to be pairwise, if it turns out to be planar, or if it turns out to be just a simple straight line, fish must be following pairwise interactions. On the other hand, if it shows a cubic form like in the bottom right corner, it must follow a ternary interaction. Okay, and in fact that's precisely what we do. Now, without going into the methods of how we do this, what we do find is that if we analyze drift from fish schooling data, okay, and what you find is it's actually a linear or a planar function. Okay, and in fact it is not cubic. It's actually planar, it's actually not cubic. And in fact, exactly as the model predicts, this planar function is independent of the group size of animals themselves. Okay, and in fact, without going into too many details, what I can tell you is that very interestingly, we can also derive a stochastic differential equations that governs the real data. And what we find is that the stochastic differential equation is exactly same as the analytical model prediction of what the pairwise stochastic copying model says. Okay, and therefore, from this, what we conclude is the following. We say that fish are very likely following or rather, a dominant mode of interactions in fish is simple pairwise stochastic copying, and they don't do this more complex, the ternary interaction which I described here. Ternary interactions involves three fish interacting and a minority or disoriented fish turning towards other two. This doesn't happen in the fish data that we studied. Okay, and to sort of summarize what we found with big data of fish schooling is that fish follow very simple pairwise stochastic interactions. And this simple stochastic pairwise interactions cause them to move in groups and cause them to show these very fascinating patterns of polarization. Okay. And then the point number 2 and 3, I haven't had time to explain them, in this talk. Okay, and in fact, there is an additional very interesting inference we actually arrive at, which is that stochasticity, plays a very important role in how the fish is maintaining order. And that's a very interesting point, which again is possible only because we had a mathematical theory that was guiding our analysis of these data sets. Okay, now I have almost come to the end of my talk. It's 4:45. Now let me go back to this video now. This was the video I showed you when I ended that discussion on that paper of, that article on that end of theory, right? I showed you, imagine if I had this data, what can we do, right? Let's ask this question again. If I just gave you a very high quality video of fish moving in groups, what can you infer about these fish behaviors? Ecologists, animal behaviorists want to understand how animals behave, right? What can you understand from a high quality video of this type? Okay. My argument is that it's impossible to answer this question in the absence of framework, theory, and models, right? And we also have this data. This is another data. These are not fish. These are actually black buck, which are ungulates, which are found in the semi-arid grasslands of many parts of India. And this specific video was taken in Gujarat by my student Akanksha. Okay, now we can ask the same question. So I have this video. How are black buck interacting with one another? Why did they suddenly move like that? Right? How do they respond when predators attack them? To answer all these questions, just having high quality data is insufficient. They need to be driven by theory and models. Okay. So it was only because I had that physics and ecology framework to be able to ask questions. It was only because of those mathematical and computational models of this pairwise interactions, ternary interactions, and other zoo of models which I did not present. Because of the predictions of those models, we were able to analyze. Otherwise, I wouldn't even know what to gather, what to extract from those videos. So this framework told me I must extract trajectories of individuals, fish. The mathematical models, previous computational models told me focus on group polarization. Our own computational mathematical analysis showed that you must calculate this function called drift function from group polarization, and that can tell you whether fish are doing these type of simple pairwise interaction, or is it more complex ternary averaging interactions. It was only because of those theory and models that we were able to arrive and make sense of these data sets. Okay, and therefore I would sort of conclude in support of my title that big data makes sense only in light of theory. And I welcome any contradictory views to this. And before I end my talk, I want to acknowledge my fabulous lab members. So the work on the fish that I showed you was done by Jitesh, Amit, and Hari Krishnan. These were the 3 students in my lab, and in collaboration with Richard Morris and Tim Rogers. And the last video I showed about black buck was done by Akanksha, although I did not have time to show results of those analysis. Okay, and then other collaborators are Danny and Colin from IISER and Scotland, respectively. And of course, thanks to all the funding agencies, SERB, DBT, and UKE. Okay. With that, I would like to thank you all, and I welcome questions, comments, especially those who you don't agree with me. Thank you very much. I'm open for questions, comments.
Yes, there are a few. We try to keep it a bit limited because I think everybody's internet connections are going through a bit of a glitch. This question comes from Nikita, I think, and it says how models and theories are different in the context of ecology. This might be a long answer. Should I repeat it?
Sorry, I could not hear you. Sorry. Yes,
Yeah.
please. Yes,
So
please.
the question is, I'll also switch off. The question is, how is model and theory different in the context of ecology? Do you
Uh-huh.
face a lot of difference?
I'm sorry, I'm actually unable to hear. There's a lot of disruption. I'm unable to hear you. Uh, Hello.
Dr. Guttal, actually, I
Is
can
it?
hear
Is it?
Ritika clearly.
Oh,
Can
okay.
you,
It's my internet then.
might be. Can you
Okay.
just check Q&A box?
Yeah,
She's
sure,
reading those
sure.
questions.
Yeah. Which one should I start from the beginning? Maybe is that fine?
Yeah, from the first one. Yeah.
Haha. So, are you able to hear me now clearly?
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
Yes.
So the first question is by an anonymous attendee who says, how do how do how we have data without observing if models are not useful then? I don't think I fully understand this question. Of course, I'm indeed saying that we must observe. All that I'm saying is that to make observations and to gather data, what kind of data to gather from observations, we need a theoretical framework. So in the absence of theoretical framework, and in fact, if not only a framework, ideally we also need a theory which tells you compute this. In the absence of those, we may not we may not even know what to collect, and we may not know what is the precise measurement that's actually useful to us. So of course we need to make observations. We must make observations, but what do we observe and what do we extract from those observations will be driven by theory. And the second question, what are those specific ways to collecting big data? So, again, there is no universal answer to this. For the question about animal groups that I was interested, it was basically get, as high quality information about their movement trajectories over time, right? So in such a case, in the case of fish we studied, it was a simple video camera that did the trick. If I want to study something which is not visible, maybe I have to look for some other modes of collecting data. If it's, let's say, if we want to understand ecosystems, how ecosystems change over time, I guess the big data usually now these days come from satellite observations. We now have really high quality data, even at sub-meter resolutions, over fairly frequent intervals, like 15 days to some 1 month, and we can, that could be a useful data for those kind of questions. Okay, so it really depends on the question. If you are studying brain, again, the methods of collecting data are going to be remarkably different, right? You may have to plant some electrodes, you may depend on MRI scans. Again, the scale of measurements depends on what you're interested in. Okay, yeah, so that's the general answer. And then another question is, big data only for one type of thing or many types of thing? We include different. Okay, so okay, I think this seems to overlap maybe with the previous question. um, I
You
don't
can
think I
skip
fully.
it.
So I can
You
skip. I
can
think
skip
it
it.
sort of overlaps with the previous two questions. Okay, so how model and theory of, that's a very good question. How are models and theories different? So I have been in the entire talk using them interchangeably. I haven't made a huge distinction between them, and because I thought the focus of this talk was not to, the distinction was not particularly important for the focus of my talk today. So maybe one way to think about this is the following. Think of the classic example of evolution, right? So we have theory of natural selection, right? And then which basically tells how species change over time, how gene frequencies change over time, right? So that forms the broad theory. Now I want to understand, let us say, that in the context of how animals compete with one another in the context of limited resources. Now that would then maybe become a model of how animals negotiate these conflicts. Okay, now that's a specific model, but the theory remains broad. That's sort of analogous to Newton's laws of motion, which just tells you how to view how the what does, if you apply a force, what happens to particles, right? Now let's say now I want to apply it to and I want to apply it and make sense of solar system, like a system where there is one star and maybe there are 10 planets, let us say, right? Now I will have a model of solar system in that case, where we use those equations to come up with within some reasonable approximation. So the models are usually slightly more specific applications. Theories are more general principles and uh, you know um, you know that we follow. So that's the way one can think of them as different. The next question by Divpreet. Ecology has always been a fascinating subject. Um, I would like to ask, how much do you think principles of ecology can be applied on cellular level and understand some mechanisms which still haven't been deciphered? That's a fabulous question. In fact, there are already people who are, thinking on the lines that you are saying. For example, if you now want to understand cancer, right? You know how cancer progression happens. People have discovered the limitations of understanding molecular mechanisms alone. They have realized that at the end of the day, cancer is a collective phenomenon. It happens by collection of cells, and what the collection of cells do often is can be fundamentally different from what each individual cell may have done on its own. And likewise, the ecology becomes important because cells are all basically looking for resources, just like organisms look for resources in ecosystems. So there are again parallels of ecological principles at the cellular level when there are aggregates of cells. So these principles of even collective motion, there is a recent review article, in fact, by my colleague Mohit Jolly in IISER, who argues that the group behavior of cells is actually very important to understand cancer cell migration. So, it's not only hypothetical anymore. These principles of ecology and evolution are already being increasingly applied in cellular systems. So there is a question: can the Earth's gravitational force affect the motion of living organisms? Well, of course it does. We have to overcome gravity when we move every time. So I don't know. Maybe I don't know if I misunderstood the question. Of course it does. Right? I'm sitting here on my chair because of gravitational force. Otherwise, I would be floating. Okay. There's another question: can temperature and pressure in different ecosystems affect the motion and speed of fishes? That's actually a great question. So in fact, I don't know of studies offhand immediately. We do know that temperature affects the metabolic rates, and the metabolic rates affect movement. So yes, I'd be surprised if they don't affect animal movement. Okay, but first, to what degree does it affect, and do again organisms undergo adaptation to overcome the consequent effects? I don't think those are well studied. At least I'm not aware of those studies. Okay, do fishes that act differently with different water depth and different light conditions in the lab? Okay, that's a great question. What do you suggest for life science students for in? Let me answer the first part of it by Amit Tegde, where he's asking, do fish behave differently when they are different water depths? I think entirely possible. When they are near the surface of water, they have more light, maybe less nutrients, and the way they move could be very different compared to when they are deep in the water. Okay. So in fact, I think there are studies that do show that the kind of geometric shape the animals form, the fish groups form, can also be different depending on what depth they are in. And so for our study, the fish system we choose, they're actually usually found in brackish waters, but they're also found in shallow waters. So it seems like, we did experiments in the shallow water conditions, which may have been a reasonable approximation. And we do know that, for example, even zebrafish are found in shallow water conditions. Okay. What do you suggest for life science students for India, materials, books, or articles to understand more about collective animal behavior? If you email me, I'll be happy to send you materials. And you can also look up my website, where I think I have put in some materials, basic materials for beginners to read. Okay. And there's a last question here. Can I take a last question?
Yeah, sure, sir. Sure.
Yeah. How can we predict the ecological communities or behaviors of plants and animals on their stochastic movements with respect to environmental concerns from the perspective of Difficult question, I think this will require clearly, some PhD thesis kind of work to understand. But anyway, it's a great question by,
Thank you,
I think
sir. What we
Laishram
will be doing
Dhanakumar.
is,
Okay.
yeah, thank you, sir.
Thank
What we
you.
will be doing is we will be posting these questions to you so that you have some more time to answer them. And as you can see, a lot of more questions are definitely streaming in. So thank you very much for that wonderful talk today, because it kind of helped us understand that just as an atom, interacts with another atom, that's what happens in groups of animals, and that's how models are evolved, and still a lot of learning that needs to happen at that end. So thank you very much for that, very insightful lecture. And we will definitely be posing these questions across to you so that we can give them an answer, and we'll be writing back to them. Thank you for all the participants. This is also a humble request that kindly use the link in the window for filling in the feedback form. And please do type in your name correctly so that the certificate has your right name. And I'd like to also take this opportunity on behalf of the entire Manav team to make an announcement for the next webinar, which is going to be addressed by Professor Kavita Jain on the 13th of May, where the topic she's going to be talking about is randomness in biological evolution. So I'm requesting all student members who are participating on YouTube and also on other live channels to please join us on 13th May and continue help us take this data series forward. So thank you, Dr. Vishwesha. This was the 25th in the series of the Manav Data Science webinar series. So thank you very much. And I hope you had a wonderful interaction. The questions will definitely be sent out across to you. So thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation and the opportunity again. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. With that, we will be signing off. Please ensure that you fill in the feedback link that has been provided to you in the window below. And please ensure that you do join us for the next, which will be the 26th webinar addressed by Professor Kavita Jain on Thursday, 13th May. Thank you. Thank you so much.